Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. This episode is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Call us at 719-452-4803. Here's your host, Trevor Sherry.
Thank you for joining us today on Candid Conversations. I am thrilled about the discussion that we're going to have today. It is something that we've talked about a lot about in the office lately, and we have one of our board members joining us, Kristie Tammillow, who is, in my opinion, a superhero. But I will let you introduce yourself and kind of explain a little bit of what we're talking about today and where you're coming from.
Yeah. Well, I am a former educator. I ran a gifted program in Fairfax County, Virginia, and in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, and have a lot of experience with a gifted community and with kids in general and parents. And I've seen, especially in Fairfax County, which was a very affluent neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C., where they also had a suicide cluster, the same kinds of things that we were seeing here. And that's how I got involved in all of this.
Yeah. And just to preface it, we are talking about this concept of redefining success for our kids.
Yes.
So, Kristie, you and I met, over a year ago?
Yes.
It's been a year and a half already.
Wow, I think so.
It's been a long time. And just for our listeners, that we came together over a common interest and desire to help the community. For those that don't know that are listening, Colorado Springs and El Paso County had over 40 teen suicides in 2015 and 16. In 2017, we've had 4, which is still a tragedy.
Yes.
But we met over coffee and just this desire to go, how do we shape or shift or change culture around success for our kids? And you and I and another one of our former board members, Leith McHugh, did a Parent Talk series last year and then in the fall, and just really engaging that. So, Kristie, as we begin this conversation, maybe set the stage a little bit for our listeners of how is success modeled in our communities right now. Before we redefine it, let's define it first so that our listeners can understand what that looks like.
Well, basically, in education, today we have a lot of testing that we have to deal with, and that's just part of the culture today. But it does raise issues for a lot of kids and families because there's a lot of pressure today to succeed and be successful. And Carol Dweck talks a lot about this growth mindset. And we really do need to have a growth mindset with our kids. It's not all about your success, but, just feeling good about who you are as a person. The fact that you woke up today should be enough, that we don't have all this stuff that we have to prove to the world. But I think in this climate of testing, that's one of the negative things that comes out of it, is that kids feel like I've got to be better, I've got to be more, I'm somehow not enough. And helping parents to understand, ways to talk about a growth mindset and to shift this whole success thing into more of a growth mindset of, you're okay who you are, and let's just be the best version of yourself that you can be. But that you don't have to have a certain grade point average, or you don't have to have a certain standing in your class, or you don't have to, take 4 AP classes this year to be good enough.
So for our listeners, remember, go back and listen to, we did a whole podcast on growth versus fixed mindset and talked about Carol Dweck. And I'm glad that we're talking about this again, because it's just a good reminder. But the interesting thing for me is when and I'm sure you've done this too, when you go out and talk to parents, they're like, but doesn't GPA matter? Doesn't how many AP test classes they can take matter for their college career and their success? What would you say to a parent that comes to you, as we're laying this foundation, what would you say to a parent that comes to you and kind of fights you on that paradigm?
Well, one of the things that I talk about a lot with parents is what it's going to look like in the future for their kids. And really, their kids need to learn not so much how to take tests, but how to live life. And they've got to be able to be flexible. They've got to be resilient. They've got to be gritty. They've got to have all of these qualities in the lives that they're going to lead because of exponential technologies in the future, nanotech, biotech, autonomous cars, all of these things that are going to affect the future, it's going to affect their jobs. And so these kids are going to be lifelong learners. So it's not going to be, they shouldn't be groomed to just take in information and regurgitate it on a test. They really need to have life skills that help them in these jobs where they're going to have to be continuously learning. They're going to be lifelong learners. And literally, these exponential technologies will impact the jobs that they're in. They'll have to go back to school, get more education, then come back, and maybe another kind of technology will impact it further, and they'll have more schooling to have to go to. And so it's going to be a very different future, not like for us where you stayed in a job for 30 years. It's going to be very different. So they're going to have life skills that are going to be really, really important. And that means knowing how to learn and relearn.
Well, something that I'm hearing, Kristie, is that maybe we've been defining success from the past of what success could have been if we were born 30 years previous.
That's exactly right.
And that's not applicable anymore.
It's not. And we're sort of in a time warp, and that's why we have to help parents understand what the future that their kids are going to be living in are going to be like. And they really do need to be lifelong learners. And not saying anything against education, it's just that it's a bureaucracy and it's slow to change. And so that's kind of where we are. We're stuck in the past. Think about it. Kids can change their world at the touch of a button. And they can get information at the touch of a button, but yet we have a system that is kind of stuck in this mentality that, we have to be the disseminators of knowledge when really they can get any kind of knowledge they want at the touch of their fingertip.
So if parents are here listening to us right now and going, yes, this is what we're supposed to do, I agree.
Yes.
And yet my kids are still going to school and they're still demanding us to test and they're still doing these kinds of things. Like so what I'm hearing too is that it needs to be almost a grassroots.
It does.
In the home.
It does.
Communities encouraging each other, neighbors encouraging. How do we do this in a way that doesn't adversely impact our kids, but encourages them to become that lifelong learner in the midst of a system that's going to take
some time to change. Yes. Well, I think it starts with people like us who come out of the woodwork and say, hey, we can do things differently, and you can be those change agents in the world, in your little community, who do things differently, and challenging parents to teach their kids about a growth mindset, and that the brain has a great deal of plasticity, and that you're always learning, and that it's not just about a given test on any given day, and that's how smart you are. Really, it's way more than that. And so I think just being those change agents and giving parents the information and the knowledge so that they can change how they're looking at something and help their kids change how they look at something.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful concept. And I think I'm glad that there's people like you and others that we've met that are really championing this. Carol Dweck is amazing. And we've pushed her book on our last podcast about growth mindset and fixed mindset. And I think one of the things that we find, right, is that parents might say, okay, that's all well and good. I'm scared to start. I'm scared to, how do I take the first step? So from a practical standpoint, if you were talking to a parent going, okay, theoretically, this is wonderful. What's that first step?
Yeah. Well, start just going online and looking at people who are doing this kind of work. Ted Dintersmith is a perfect example.
Could you spell that? No, I'm just
kidding. Yeah, exactly. I don't think I can. But anyway, he's a perfect example of somebody who was helping his kid with a project. He came home and said, I'm going to be learning about all these different things in science, and, can you help me? And he was learning about simple machines. So his dad said, let's build a lever. So he did that, and he learned far more than he needed to learn because he actually built the thing. So it was all hands-on, project-based. And Then he went to school and took the test, but because he didn't use the word lever, he failed this test.
Oh gosh.
And but that's how it is today. You have to have that right word. And but he could show through a drawing to his teacher that he had learned far more than he was being asked on that test. And so it's just understanding that, having that kind of information, and then being able to go to the school and say, let's partner.
Sure.
Let's partner. We want to do more for our kids. We want our kids to really be able to learn in a way that's going to benefit them for the future. So let's partner together. Just having these conversations. I know I always felt respected when parents came in and said, let's do this together. Can we make this better for my kid?
Sure.
And I always was very open to that. It's when people come at us in a negative way and tell us what we're doing bad.
Right.
So we want to partner with our schools. And I just heard today at a luncheon this morning that there's a project-based learning school opening up right in Cordera. Right, and that's
very nice.
Yes, so
That's super cool.
we have one a school right here, just like Ted Dintersmith started in California, right here in our own community.
That's great.
Yeah,
I
so
love that.
exciting.
Well, it's interesting too, as we've come in contact with parents. I think it's not only do we see the needs of the kids, and I think maybe we'll save this topic for a different podcast with you about overexcitability and asynchrony and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
But the way our kids are gifted and the giftedness of our kids is changing and has been morphing over the years. So it's not just a testing giftedness or an academic quote unquote giftedness. But it's interesting as we've worked in this community, in our communities here. It's not so much that the kids would be opposed to it; it's that the parents are having a hard time.
Yes, that is correct.
Grasping this and finding the benefit in this, and it's adversely affecting our teenagers.
That's right. It's because we've gotten used to class standings and class rankings and what score you made on that test, and we like that because it feels like a security blanket to us. But when you think about it and look at it long term, it's really not the correct way to prepare somebody for the future that they're going to have that we just talked about.
Because as soon as you graduate high school, the rules of the world change completely.
Oh, absolutely.
It's no longer, I graduated in a really high performing school where I had 2 valedictorians that were also on the varsity soccer team and the basketball team and real high achievers, totally successful in high school, and have gone on to be normal Joes.
Yep.
It wasn't anything, we had great aspirations for what they would become, and then they got into the real world and it was normal.
Yes.
Like everybody else.
Yes.
It's just so different.
It is different. And I know in a conversation that you and I had a while ago, you had talked about the college satisfaction that students leave high school, top of the world, king of the hill, queen of the hill, however you want to say that.
Yes.
And they get to college and they're just going through the motions.
Right.
Do you remember I don't know if you remember the statistics, that conversation that we had. But
41.6% of kids in college are stating that anxiety is one of their biggest problems. And we're seeing more anxiety on college campuses today than ever before. And it's because we're not preparing them for what they've got to undertake.
Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is a poor analogy, but it's almost like the Stepford Wives syndrome, where we've programmed our kids to think and act a certain way, and then get into the real world, and then they're like,
right, they don't have the skills.
What?
They don't have the skills necessary to cope. That's the problem. And so we've gotta. It's become a cultural problem, and it's a big problem, and that's why we've got to have the courage to face this and do something about it, and helping parents understand. Here's a statistic. We always think that these kids who are from lower class neighborhoods are the ones who are the most risk, but in actuality, Sonia Luther did a whole lot of decades of studies on these kids in from wealthy neighborhoods who are the most at-risk kids. And so they're our at-risk population, and we're a perfect example of that right here in Colorado Springs. And yet we don't talk about that.
Right.
And that's a really important thing.
Well, and with wealth, it's that expectation that everything has to be perfect, because I think that's the American dream. That's what our culture in America has defined as successful is a lot of money, having a great net worth, and you have no problems.
Well, and it's interesting too, because and I won't name names or give a scenario, but there was an organization that we wanted to work with, and we were trying to make the case that the middle class to upper middle class to affluent populations are the most at risk out of any population.
Absolutely.
And they wouldn't partner because they felt like it was a monetary issue, not a access to care issue, and they were very amenable, very kind, and they said, if you can prove this, then call us back next year and we'll work with you. And I'm like, okay, it is a culture shift. It's a mindset shift. And it's interesting too, because access to care is even more diminished or less accessible for that population too.
That's correct.
On a mental health standpoint, or a gifted and talented testing standpoint, or any of those kinds of things. It baffles me that in our 2018, we're sitting here talking about doing some stuff the same old.
Right. I know. That's why we have to have the courage to talk about this and bring it out to the light and expose it and say, hey, we can do something about this, and we should, because it's our kids and their mental health is at stake, and it's that important.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring up a part of this conversation that's really been impactful for me, and it's that, yes, we need to redefine success as a whole.
Yes.
But redefining success also needs to happen on an individual level.
Yes.
My definition of success for my life should be different than your definition for success.
Absolutely.
As with all of my siblings. And and in order to do that, as we've talked before, it takes parents knowing their kids.
Yes.
And seeing where they can go.
That's right.
And encouraging them that direction.
Well, and it's a perpetual mindset. So for me, I mean, think about, I was just talking to a friend today over lunch going, I was trained to be a counselor.
Yeah.
This like nonprofit stuff, being a business owner, learning how to raise funds and all that kind of stuff. was never taught that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I know my tendency is to get clammed up, freaked out, and not move forward.
Yeah.
Right.
But I can't do that because of all the books I've read over the last 10 years, because of the things I know, that I can't stay in that fixed mindset, even though I know it's my propensity.
Right.
But for success for me, if I were to be completely honest, is going, I'm going to take that first step and do something that's uncomfortable and see what I learn.
Yes.
That's, for me, that's my success.
Yes.
For somebody else, it might be pulling back the reins or doing something different, right? But I think, Trevor, you make a really good point, is really taking that step back and asking ourselves, what does success look like for me? And then really calling out those fixed mindsets.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think Trevor's right in that it does look different for each family and each kid.
Yeah.
And you can't even treat each kid in your own family the same, because we're all different. And that's why I think parents have to not just look at success as this blanket thing, like my kid's got to make it into, an Ivy League school or he's just a failure. But look at it in terms of, what is my kid really good at, and what is he passionate about, and what motivates him and to get up in the morning, let me look at that and help my kid dream big and become successful in the natural gifts and traits he's been given.
Yeah. You're building identity.
Yes.
Rather than a shell of a career almost.
That's exactly right. And we've become really, we've distorted the whole idea of success in our culture.
Yeah, and Trevor and I will tackle this issue more so, and especially with Kristie on overexcitability and some giftedness piece. Yeah. But we're also going to tackle this from a suicide perspective. We haven't done that yet in our podcast. And so there's a lot of things that tie into this definition of success and redefining success that we don't have time to talk about in a 24-minute podcast, but that we will talk about over time. And I want our listeners to hang on there, because these will build on each other, and we'll do our best to categorize them in our listens, so you can find which ones kind of play on each other. But Kristie, I'm just so thankful for people like you that see the world differently and are willing to call it out and are willing to stand up and go, wait a second.
Yeah.
That's not right. That's not the way it should be, because if we didn't have people like you, I mean, we'd never have advancement. We'd never be challenged to think differently. And so I'm just grateful for you and for the impact that you're having on this community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And Kristie, something that I really enjoy doing with all of our guests on this show is asking about the most important step a person can take, which is the next one. Mm-hmm. So from this conversation, what is the next step? How can we start putting this concept into practice?
Well, I think just being courageous and doing something that might be counterculture as a parent. And, saying, what can I do differently that will help my child understand better about who he is and not make it about a system or about a cultural mindset and make it more about what best fits my kid.
Love it. Thank you, Kristie.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/Candid Conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.